Hello, Podwalkers, and welcome to another episode of Goblin Lore. In this episode, we talk about Krenko, our first actual legendary goblin, and dig into a little bit of his backstory and some of the thematic elements that go into what makes him such a fascinating character. On top of that, we dig into socialism, libertarianism, capitalism, and some big political concepts. It gets a little bit hairy at the end. That's one of the great things that we love about our cast is we all have slightly different beliefs and political ideologies, and yet we still find that way of using our ideals as a way to create equality and value for everybody. Individuals and society as a whole matter to us. So, without any further ado, let's get to the show.
Hello and welcome back, Podwalkers. This is another episode of the Goblin Lore Podcast. This week we are talking about Krenko, the mad mob boss.
What?
I'm gonna butcher that phrase so often, but the hobgoblin with the mob noblin. I don't even know. Krenko.
This could be the worst intro we've had.
Try saying that 5 times fast, though.
It seems thematically appropriate when we're talking about an actual goblin.
Yeah, that is
It's
true.
the most slapped together opening we get.
Well, and that's kind of the fun part of today is we actually get on brand in this episode, guys. This is the first episode of the Goblin Lore Podcast where we're talking goblins. And of course, it's got to be Krenko. It's got to be like the OG Goblin Tribal Commander card. But we're not just talking the card, we're talking Krenko, the mob boss from Ravnica himself. We're going to talk about whether he's a good role model, whether he's a cautionary tale. We're going to talk about where his allegiances lie and what we can learn from him. So I'm super pumped, but first I need you guys to introduce yourselves. And with that, I also want to ask you, which goblin-like quality do you feel best reflects your personality? Let's start with Alex.
Well, I'm Alex. You can find me on Twitter at AlexanderNewM. And I think maybe a little paradoxically, or maybe counterintuitively perhaps, Goblin Ringleader. No, in our last episode we talked about some struggles I've had with social anxiety, but still a very outgoing person. I love to do things with friends. I have now many years on. I have lots and lots of different groups of friends that I'm constantly trying to pull into different plans and do stuff and bring people to cons and the GP and everything. So I think Goblin Ringleader is a good fit for me, actually.
Okay, well, I'm HobbsQ. I'm at HobbsQ on Twitter.com, and I'm really stuck between two of these. So my first instinct is to go Mog Fanatic. And I just feel so bad for Mog Fanatic because of how badly Mog Fanatic ends up getting hosed by the changing of removing the stack. So if people don't know, the whole point of Mog Fanatic was Mog Fanatic would absorb a point of damage and then would sacrifice itself in order to get in another point of damage somewhere, which is greatly hit by his the artwork is basically him holding a powder keg, and the flavor text says, I got it, and cuts off. Now, I think that this is so apropos for a goblin, and actually the flavor text I'm going to come back to in a second because it ties in with what my other choice was. But Mog Fanatic I also feel bad for because Mog Fanatic got screwed by changing and taking away the stack. And to me, this actually was not intuitive from a flavor standpoint. So if people don't know, the stack used to allow you to do things like let damage be assigned, and then you could do effects after that. Mog Fanatic is one of the classic creatures that is known for using that ability. But to me, from a flavor standpoint, that actually makes a lot of sense, because if you think about a fanatic can take lethal damage and is not going to just die. As a bonus, my other choice, relatedly, was Goblin Sky Raider, which was first in Onslaught and has been reprinted. And it is also for the flavor text and for the fact that it is a 1/2 flying goblin. He's got a Leonardo da Vinci-style apparatus on his back. And the flavor text says the goblin word for flying is more accurately translated as falling slowly.
It's the Buzz Lightyear of goblins. I love it.
Yes, exactly.
Well, with that, I am Joe. You can find me on Twitter at Findhorn. That's FYND Horn. And I like to think of myself as a goat napper. And I love this card for so many reasons. So for those who don't know, Goat Napper is a 2/2 Goblin Rogue from Lorwyn. When Goat Napper comes into play, untap target goat and gain control of it until end of turn. It gains haste until end of turn. So it's a threaten effect for goats specifically. Now, I want to ask you guys, when this card was printed, how many cards in Magic the Gathering referenced goats?
Springjack Pasture, was that out yet?
Oh, I'm sorry, it was not. Incorrect.
Damn it.
I'm going to guess Mountain Goat from Ice Age, and maybe nothing else that is goat specific. Though, to go all Melvin on ya, there were a lot of goats in the Lorwyn block in the form of changelings.
I was just going to go there too.
Nice.
That's why I love you, Alex.
Nice. Yes, there were changelings, so you could steal changelings. However, you're right. There was Mountain Goat. There was Crested Craghorn. There was Kolos Yearling, Battering Craghorn, Wild Kolos, and then if you played with somebody who had any of the portal cards, you had Zodiac Goat. So no, you had like 5 cards, one card that referenced a goat even in standard at that time. It was the most useless card, and it's perfect. So if you wanted somebody to marshal all of those Goblin B Squad JV into a ragtag, fighting force, which Goblin would you turn to?
Oh, I don't know. I think Krenko might be a good choice to lead such a squad.
We're gonna talk about Krenko, the Goblin mob boss on Ravnica. He is really like, he starts off as this gutter snipe, unaffiliated with a guild, and eventually grows to become the head of a criminal, syndicate on Ravnica. And yeah, they're not nearly as sneaky as the Dimir or organized as the Boros or even maybe as explodey destructive as the Rakdos, but they do some good stuff.
Well, Krenko, what can we say that hasn't already been said many times about Krenko? Krenko literally walked into an Azorius stronghold and just didn't he just grab Feather?
Oh, yeah, the Boros. He walked into Sunhome, the Boros stronghold. So the first story that we really get introducing us to Krenko is called Krenko Mob Boss, and it was posted on the mothership on magic.wizards.com, and that'll be linked in our show notes here. But Krenko is sitting down to a meal with an odd sort of looking fellow whose skin doesn't fit too well on his body, apparently, named Mr. Taz. What we don't find out in this story, but we learn later through the stories, is this is Lazav, the Dimir shapeshifter and the head of the guild. And Mr. Taz is giving him this job to case Sunhome, the Boros, the red-white aligned soldier and angel, the Boros guild hall, sort of their fortress, basically.
And they're like the combination between the police force and the military.
Right.
They're not just some local constabulary. This is a serious law enforcement business.
Right. They are, and they're a real deal when it comes to fighting. And so you'd think that security at Sunhome would be a lot better, but Krenko strolls on in. For a while, he's sitting on top of some roofs and, watching people through a telescope, and he's like, nah, this sucks. I'm gonna go in. And so the next day he goes in, walks into the mess hall, sits down, and helps himself to some free, whatever, some eggs, and I think it says, duck eggs or, all sorts of stuff. And he just starts listening and realizes all the tension that's going on. This is a way to introduce the conflict for the Return to Ravnica story. But Krenko is just loving the fact that there is all this tension around him, because he's like, oh yeah, yep, one little push and this whole powder keg goes off. And so I have to read this bit here. This is one of the funniest lines in the Krenko story. Chaos is the best cover, and Krenko went about setting fires and kicking down doors. Floor 1, an incendiary rumor in a willing ear. Floor 2, punch yesterday's pompous goblin on his fat nose. Floor 3, spark bombs. Floor 4, actual bombs.
I mean, what we have to realize is what's funny about this, like Alex said, this isn't just your constabulary. This is the Boros, right? This is a garrison. They're not too bright. I am fairly certain they're sort of racist and just assume that Krenko is really a Legion loyalist.
Yeah. Yeah.
They just like, well, it's a goblin. It's here. It probably belongs here. I don't really care about it or notice it.
Right, and we will get into that later on, too, when we talk about the real-world impact. But yeah, that's important to note, is that they don't... I think they assume that... Well, and it says he joined a goblin maintenance crew, so that's maybe part of his cover, but nobody thinks twice about, like, maybe we should see some ID from you. And so the point of this story is that Krenko gets to the top floor of Sunhome and gets to the private chambers of Feather, who is the angel, if you remember the Ravnica story, is the angel that was Agris Kos, the protagonist of that story, Agris Kos's partner on the beat. And Feather has now ascended to being the guildmaster of the Boros. But there's some sort of infighting going on. Another angel says that a fallen angel, a disgraced angel, should never be allowed to be the guildmaster, and so there's all this tension and blah, blah, blah. And really, like, Krenko just basically takes a glowy shiv that Lazav gave him and, like, breaks the detention sphere that Feather's in and says that she was attacking him, and then he runs out in the chaos, and then an explosion blows a hole in the side of the building. So
I think my favorite part of the MTG, like the Gamepedia wiki on this, Feather was freed during a secretive raid performed by Krenko. I think we're giving him a lot of credit for being secretive here.
Yeah, he like grabbed a janitor's uniform, threw it on, and then that was that. That's the amount of secretitude.
And then started setting explosives.
Right. Like calling giant attention, and then saw something shiny and broke it open.
Even for a goblin, that's not really secretive. Like the first floor, like rumors, okay, that's like subtle goblin stuff. Punching a goblin, that could kind of be subtle if he punches, walks away, and like that starts a fight behind him. But setting off bombs?
And so it's important to note that this is basically like Krenko's origin story. He's a young goblin at the time. Like this is kind of his like make it big moment. This is when he starts to get prove his worth to the Dimir and start to get hired for other jobs. It's also important to note that he's not a member of the Dimir. He is brought in by the Dimir to basically do the jobs that they don't want to do and get their own hands dirty. I love that they actually call this not a knife, it's an enchanted shiv.
Yeah.
There's a lot of power and a lot of magic and a lot of even just political power wrapped up in the guild structure. So the people who aren't part of that structure have very little power. They have very little agency. And so a big part of Krenko is that he is part of this guildless group that is kind of taken their agency back.
We actually see this, too, become kind of him in some ways being made, if we really want to stick with this mafia kind of language. He kind of in some ways is his first successful, huge mission where he's going to start bringing power to him among these unaffiliated to the point where he is developing organized crime. He is pulling all of this unorganized, unaffiliated goblins, these people that we would think of as like this chaos of goblins, because that's what we generally think of with chaos and what we see mainly with goblins. And he's actually organizing them.
I think it would be great also if that was the like term for a group of goblins, a chaos of goblins.
I mean, that's
canon.
Be it.
I would also like to call attention to the fact that in the art for Krenko Mob Boss, you can see in the back alley behind him the two goblins that are on the card Krenko's command. I think that's pretty cool. Just as a little flavor note there for you. believe both of those cards were, in fact, yes, they were done by Karl Kopinski. Shout out to the homie. So that is actually a perfect transition as we discuss the guild lists to talk about the other story that we see Krenko in on the Magic Mothership again. We see him show up in Limits. Limits was published in 2015. I will link this again in the show notes. And it's talking about the trials that Gideon is going through, Gideon the Planeswalker, as he bounces back and forth between Zendikar and Ravnica, trying to stop the Eldrazi threat on Zendikar and trying to protect the innocent civilians of Zendikar. We referenced this a little bit, and specifically Michelle Rapp referenced this in her article on Gideon and Trauma. This is that point where he starts to wear down, get sloppy, all that sort of stuff, because he's just, grinding himself to the ground. But this isn't a Gideon podcast. This is a Krenko cast. So Krenko comes in because he is the one stirring up all the crap on Ravnica. There is basically a goblin gang war happening between Krenko's mob and the Shattergang brothers. It's consuming the entire Foundry Street, Tin Street, the whole goblin district. The way that this goes down is Dargig, a goblin black market weapons runner, the youngest of the Shattergang brothers, was found stabbed in an alley off of Tin Street, and word had spread that Krenko did the deed himself when a weapons drop went bad. So, organized crime, they have their rules, they have their, they need to work together. It's not like mobs don't ever communicate, but when one of them pushes the other, things go a little bit awry. And so Krenko, being a goblin of honor, took his vengeance on one of the Shattergang brothers. Well, there are obviously two remaining Shattergang brothers, and those two, along with the rest of the mob, decided to set off a series of explosions across the district, blowing up Krenko's warehouses. Basically now, it is full-on goblin war in the streets, and, many of these people, and I think this goes underappreciated, undernoticed when we're talking about the story of Ravnica, is that many of the people of Ravnica are non-guild affiliated. Many people are just living their lives on Ravnica doing their thing. These people are all caught in the blowback between these two between these two warring factions. And so Gideon tries to step in and, put a stop to this. He tries to apprehend the Shattergangs. He eventually does apprehend Krenko. He's the only character in Magic canon so far to have made Gideon bleed. That's pretty impressive.
And well, if in the story too, he brings Krenko in, right?
Right.
And tells people, and then Krenko's like, "I got him twice."
Yep. Yeah, it's kind of this great thing where Gideon brings him into the Boros. Again, they're the law enforcement, and
welcome back, buddy.
Right. Have fun. And
I've been here. This place looks familiar. The Sun Home is nice.
Right. And he's just grinning. He's just having a great time. And a Shattergang message drops in. It looks like one of their classic bombs. They have a very distinctive way of making their bombs, these vials with these metal bands around them. It turns out to just be a message that says basically turn Krenko over to the Shattergangs for our retribution, or the entire Boros will now be liable. So now that street war of the guild list has spread to affect a guild, and now the guilds step in. And that's an important note that we're going to talk about in a minute. The last bit here that I really want to note, that I love this about Krenko's character, is decision time, Krenko taunted. Get him out of there, Dars barked. I want him behind bars. You see, Jura, Krenko said as soldiers dragged him away. The Boros won't turn me into the Shattergang brothers. What now? And so he's a little bit of this, he's playing as many sides as he can, even when he's apprehended. He is very much, set himself in this non-affiliated, full neutral place. I mean, he's chaotic, for sure, but he's set himself... I think he's less chaotic... If we were to put him in D&D terms, he's less chaotic than the average goblin. I would say that he is more neutral. I
mean, it's you can't really be a boss in some ways if you're too chaotic. And I mean, we're going to get into this, I think, a little bit when we bring this to history or the real world.
Gideon, who has been set up in multiple stories to just be shown as one of the multiverse's biggest badasses, he may not have like great gobs of magic powder throw around, but Gideon doesn't get hurt. He can just stand up to anything and is tenacious. And we see like a goblin kind of getting the better of him, despite the fact that the goblin is the one who's arrested. And
Right.
there's just something compelling about the character specifically, generally set up as villains, but there's something compelling about that character who gets caught and is arrested and seems to be, you know, out of play, and yet the whole time they're just acting like, yep, this is all part of my plan. It's, I don't know, there's something compelling there.
Right, and that's one thing that the stories show us, and you know his description on the mothership tells us too, is he's extremely charismatic, dangerously so. I think it's actually his flavor text on his card that says this as well. He displays a perverse charisma fueled by avarice, highly dangerous. Recommend civil sanctions, and that's a quote by an Azorius bureaucrat, essentially. And so that's actually a really good transition point for us into our real world talk. I want to turn this over to you guys here since I talked most of the lore background, but where does Krenko fit into our real world understanding? He's this charismatic mob boss. He is this, you know, perversely violent, you know, he really enjoys violence. Like that is very clear, but he's not chaotic. He's not stupid. He's not, you know, he's not somebody that people don't want to follow. He's not a loner. He is a leader.
I mean, he's charismatic. I mean, that's where we're starting off with here, right? I mean, for a goblin, especially, which we generally think of as being depicted as ugly from a typical beauty standard, that we do not think of as being the attractive heroes, he has charisma. I mean, he has that ability to what we said. He didn't get questioned basically walking into a garrison. He walked in, he was able to look like he belonged, and then he starts just doing violence. And, you know, there's something to be said for being drawn to that, even if it's talking about something to do with sociopathy or psychopathy, which is really what we're talking about when we're talking about a sociopath or antisocial personality disorder. That one of the things about that, so if we're kind of bringing it to the psychology world for a second here, antisocial personality disorder is really characterized by kind of this pervasive ability to not really be able to tell the difference between right and wrong or care, and kind of really be self-serving and self-centered. And where it's been studied less rigorously, the idea of sociopathy is really what we think of when we see most movies. It is the person who can function in a social crowd. So, you know, let's think of something like American Psycho. Technically, if anybody's ever seen that, you know, it's the Christian Bale character. He's still very charismatic, versus Dexter, who has trouble blending in, doesn't really fit in, because he is more of a closer what we think of as kind of being the antisocial personality. Like that's the typical what I would think of in a clinical sense, versus in the media we really are enamored with this idea of the sociopath. Somebody that can appear charming and then is going to kill you. And so we're actually kind of seeing that with Krenko here, with his also, you know, for both of these, even when we're talking about antisocial personality, another key hallmark is this kind of inability to control your impulses. Like even in situations where it would probably be smart to do it, it's how most serial killers end up getting caught. Is they believe that they truly are smarter, and they eventually do something that gets them caught.
And that's sort of what we see here too, is he does get caught. We don't know exactly how he got caught. You know, the story doesn't cover that in Limits, but he gets brought in, and something about that trips him up.
And that is interesting too, because looking from a sort of color pie standpoint in Magic, you know, the underlying philosophies of the different colors, a lot of times red gets glossed over as just the violence and things, but the impulsiveness is a big part of that. The person, a piece of red philosophy is just you should do what makes you happy, and you shouldn't have to hamper what you want to do just to get along with other people. And I really like when Wizards is able to sort of show something where you have like cathartic reunion in Red from Kaladesh, where Chandra is reuniting with her mom for the first time in years and years. That is a very Red thing that isn't tied to violence. And so it's interesting that Krenko has some piece of that.
Well, I think it shows too that, Red is not the absence of intelligence. What we're seeing here in a Red character that is a legend and is very popular among Red EDH or Commander players for this reason is actually a very intelligent goblin who also still cannot inhibit those Red abilities. Kind of thinking about this in the real world, are we looking at a true mafioso here? Or are we looking at something more akin to the Joker from Batman?
Yeah, is he the Ravnica goblin version of Al Capone? For a long time, I don't think people know this so much about the history here with Al Capone, but back in the day when he was, involved in the rum running and all the bank robberies and all that sort of stuff, he was sort of seen as this folk hero. Like, he was romanticized as this Robin Hood-esque sort of guy, even though he never stole from the rich and gave to the poor. He just stole from other people to make himself rich. But he was seen as this outlaw, this dangerous badass, and he was frankly violent and awful.
I mean, we also saw it later in the 20th century with John Gotti. I mean, he was called the Teflon Don. I mean, that's where that nickname comes from, because they couldn't make anything stick to him until he actually had somebody basically rat on him that went into witness protection. And this guy was known. I mean, it was the same thing. Everybody knew who he was and what he was doing, but he was out in New York City at fancy restaurants being photographed. I mean, there really was an obsession with him.
Yeah, so there are these cult of personalities around these guys that, I think that does get a little bit towards the charisma of Krenko. It sort of has that organized crime element too. But we also do see some of those qualities in the Joker as well, right?
Well, I think that's where we're kind of talking to once we really get more into the chaos and the impulse control.
There's some similarities in the highly intelligent, even when he appears to be caught, he still has things going on, but I think there's also some differences there in the character, and some of that I think lends towards some of Krenko's redness. I mean, and characters are not necessarily just one note too. It's also a fairly common black thing that while you care about yourself, you can also kind of care about your group. I mean, that's how black-white tends to work. They're very focused on their group, and they don't care about any other groups.
I guess the problem is we don't have enough, in my opinion, yet. I would, in some ways, maybe when we return to Ravnica, we will get to see more of Krenko. Because the question is, does he really care about them or not? I mean, we know that he's organized them, but is that to get to his end that he needs or what he wants?
Yeah, it's a fair question. We don't have a ton of info on it. We don't have a ton of things to tell us.
I mean, because if we're gonna jump in and think a little bit more, I'm coming back to the Joker piece. If we're going with the version, let's say, of Heath Ledger, which is actually a very well written version, it brings in a lot of the elements of the comic book that are actually really key to him. But we see him in heists with his gang. We don't see Krenko in heists or in his missions really with his gang. We only see him doing those kind of more that alone type of thing, like when he goes into Sunhome. We're dropped in the middle of their story, and I'm the type of person that we don't always need an origin story. Especially with some of this more, we don't know somebody's motivations and they seem kind of chaotic. The lack of an origin story actually works a lot better.
What we know about him is that he came from being a guildless goblin who lived out of the gutters, and try saying that 5 times fast, but and got his first big break by being a hired thug for the Dimir, not as a part of the Dimir again, but hired out freelancing for them. And that's kind of it. But it also sort of lends me a little bit to, I think we've talked about this off air, sort of a little bit in the way of a, Last Jedi sort of thing, where maybe it doesn't matter where he came from, because where he is now is who he is. And that's kind of that cool thing of at this point in the story, this is what he is and what he does. And he's, I like that he's almost this force of nature in the same way that Heath Ledger's Joker was. We don't know what drives him other than greed, other than, the desire for violence. But what does he do with the greed? What does he do with the power? What does he do with the things he gets once he has them? That's fascinating.
So Alex, kind of coming back to what you were saying a little bit with the mono red kind of qualities of him, but his ability to kind of have that, in some ways, what we think, we don't know. Maybe we're going to learn more about this, the love of his kind. Maybe whether that's the guildless or specific other goblins, the goblins that he is the boss of. I mean, do we see him shifting colors but remaining guildless, which would be a very interesting thing in terms of Ravnica?
I think that could be interesting. You don't have to be in other colors to care for other people. And so it would be interesting to see Krenko develop and to go into another color and to develop that way as a character. But kind of the other mind, you also don't have to shift him into another color to continue to develop him. You can continue to develop his character, keeping him in that mono red space. I throw this in here because it sounds like, and we don't have a whole lot of him talking to other goblins. And so this is it sounds like a little speech that he's giving. So he says, "We won't sit like lazy gobslugs waiting for death to come to us. We'll bring death, shiny, sharp, to our enemies." Seems like he really does have a group that he is working with. I think it would be interesting to see that develop, whether they decide to pull him into another color or not. I do hope that there's some development of his character, because it's in the world of guilds, which are also really cool and fun to develop. It's nice to see that other side of the world.
And so I guess maybe, like I said, it doesn't need to be him, but this idea of color-aligned guildless, or just like multicolored guildless, now that we're returning to Ravnica for the third time. Yeah. And we've already been so inundated with guilds. Like, what is the result of this? Do we have people that are these colors that just are because that's who they are, not because they belong to guilds?
The guildless, so this, like you're saying, this is their third time to Ravnica, and it's been a little while, but I don't recall there being much guildless in the first Ravnica. It was about the guilds. And then the Nephilim, just in case people didn't care for the guilds, that was weird and something different. It wasn't really until the second Ravnica block where we had that idea of, where they at least introduced it in the cards in the story, where there was, here are the guilds, and then here are the other people that aren't part of that system, that don't get the benefits of that system and are kind of being taken advantage of by this system.
And what's funny too is, if we want to go as far as the actual card frame, we get our watermarks. We get cards being very easily to tell just by looking at a monocolored card, are you part of a guild or not?
We get to see not only a character who works and operates outside of the guild system, we get to see how the guild system treats the other citizens. And it says verbatim in the Limits story that the gilded people basically didn't care about the street wars that were happening as long as they didn't stray into gilded territory. As long as it didn't affect them behind their gates, they were fine. They were willing to let all these goblins kill each other and kill themselves without, any sort of impact on their lives.
There's a card from Gatecrash, and I love this flavor text, and I didn't see this pay off in the stories too much. Urbis Protector. URBIS Protector. It's a 1/1 for 6, but you get a 4/4 angel when you play him. But I love this flavor text is actually a quote from two guild leaders. Tesa of the Orzhov talking to Lazav of the Dimir says, "I hear that Boros is losing its angels to the Gateless movement. I'm sure this comes as no surprise to you." And like, that little piece of world building was so interesting to me. The whole idea that you have this movement outside of the guilds, trying to be like a counter to the guilds. And it makes a lot of sense when you look at what the guilds were doing. Like you're saying, like there's all these street wars going on, and the guilds didn't care. Even Boros, who's the guild that is the peacekeepers, they should be the ones caring. Didn't matter to them until gilded territory was affected.
Right. No, I love that. And I love that too, that it's guildless movement. It's not just people who've been sort of left aside and that the guilds didn't choose them. There are people choosing to leave the guilds. That's fascinating.
Well, and in this, like the angels, but my understanding, like they're constructs, they are basically built to fulfill purposes. And the fact that angels are choosing to leave this guild that they've been serving, presumably as part of their purpose. They're like, no, you know what, I'm going to go help these guys over here because this fulfills my purpose better, is really interesting.
There's this element of Ravnica that lives outside of the system that not only we as the story readers and the game players understand as the main point of Ravnica. It's the, when Ravnica is the city of guilds. It's a city plane made by guilds, sustained by guilds. That's the whole branding. And so that does get us to an interesting discussion point here. How do we understand that in society, this sort of, in our real world society, this sort of like left outness? There's something different between people not being allowed to participate in the system and people being ousted or choosing to leave the system. To me, I'll speak freely about my political beliefs here for sure, is like I'm a socialist by my understanding, and we can get into a longer discussion. If anyone wants to engage with me on Twitter about that, know what exactly I mean by that, we can do that. But basically, I believe that it's the system's job to provide a baseline for everybody to live at. And I think that's what the Guild Pact was originally supposed to do, ensure a baseline of civility.
And it was supposed to instill these 10 organizations into specific niches to create this fabric for society.
But now you have this group of people who have either been left out of the system or chose to leave the system or have been forced out of the system, who aren't represented by the Guild Pact. And even after, when we return to Ravnica, the Guild Pact is done. Jace is the living Guild Pact, but the magic of the original Guild Pact is gone. So this whole thing to me is this push and pull between what the purpose of a system is. And I think that's cool to think about, especially in our world today, where we're wrestling with, frankly, as Americans, we're wrestling with a lot of that same stuff. What is the purpose of the system? What is the purpose of each of us in the system? Is our duty to be a neighbor and a fellow citizen first, or is it to be our own citizen first? And that's a big question. I don't know that I have an answer on what it is, but
no,
it's
I certainly
fascinating.
Don't. That's a thing that I've kind of been wrestling with a lot myself, thinking about what is the role of the society and what should it be providing. And there's the idea for a while I kind of considered myself a libertarian, and now I think unfortunately there's a lot of people who like to use that term to defend beliefs that aren't really defendable. But the concept that appealed to me was the idea that people should generally be left to their own devices. The person, and this actually is interesting. You talk about color ply philosophies. This is kind of a black philosophy, that each person knows best how to take care of themselves. So each person should be empowered to take care of themselves because they're in the best position to do it. And that idea it's not necessarily rejected, but it's still now looking at a lot of other realities of actual reality and things that happen in societies and things that are going on. It's like, that's a great ideal, but I don't know how practical of an ideal it is. Generally, people should be able to do what they want, but at the extreme, that's saying, well, government can't this and that. But the whole point of having a society, the whole point of having a government, is to create a fabric in which people can live. So it's where does that fabric get a say because it's what's best, and where do the individuals get a say because, again, they're the ones who can choose best for themselves.
Too, I think it's interesting that we see a system fail the guildless people here, because the Boros shouldn't be just the defenders of the gilded. You know, that's never stated. To my understanding, that's never stated, is that the Boros are the military or the police force, the protectors of just those who are affiliated with one of the 10 guilds. It's the backbone of society, trying to help keep everyone safe. And so, again, we look at the reflections of that. We see far too often that people get left out, and that people do, like you said, that fabric gets frayed, and the message from this, and I think that's interesting, is the message of Krenko is, when that fabric frays, crime thrives. It's not just I don't think this is just a Law and Order story. I think this is frankly like no, if you're not looking out for everybody, then somebody gets exploited. Kind
of jumping in here, it does seem like I will admit, when I was much younger, I definitely adhered a lot more to kind of libertarian ideals. I liked the idea of it because I didn't like the idea of people being told what they could and couldn't do. And to me, I think it was my initial phase of trying to reconcile my social beliefs with some of my more conservative fiscal beliefs. Especially when it came to things like, I grew up in a blue-collar family, and I really didn't like the idea of taxes and felt that was pretty and I grew up in an environment where the Second Amendment was held as like this really unalienable right in some ways. And so I'm like, well, yeah, sure, people can have guns, but also then you can marry whoever you want, and I just don't care. And I've learned, I think that part of that, for me at least, was through a lens for me of privilege, because I didn't have to pay attention in some ways to what I guess we could say is the guildless. It means that somebody eventually is going to get exploited.
Ultimately, one of the things that I have learned that has maybe put me into the area of confusion, not confusion so much as
questioning.
That's a beautiful word for it, and which I think is a great place to be, because that means you're a little more open to all the things that you don't know and understand yet, is the fact that things are a lot more complex. And so having this one little byline is really fun and quippy, but it's not really practical when you start to look at the real world. And I think talking about the difference between freedom and anarchy is a good way to illustrate that, is that freedom, like you're saying, is the ability to make choices, and sometimes you need to have a structure to limit certain choices to make you free to choose other choices.
You run into the fact of that at some point, to me, this is where I've kind of understood the distinction between them. Like, freedom only works if everybody has the ability to have it. Anarchy would say you're literally free to do anything, which could then impinge on somebody else's freedom.
That's a really clear way of saying that quality, I think, of, that's the civil society idea. That's the fabric of society, that coexistence piece is, if I can't exist as a result of your freedom, then I'm not free. And in that way, is it really true freedom across the board? Whew, we got heady here.
Yeah. So how do we transition to the outro from here?
I was like,
speaking of freedom and speaking of freedom and anarchy, we'll see you all at GP Minneapolis. It's like, I don't know.
That's our show. Thank you all for listening. You can find the podcast at Goblin Lore Pod on Twitter. You can find Joe Redemann at Findhorn, that's Fynd Horn. You can find Hobbs Q at Hobbs Q, and you can find Alex at Alexander New M. You can email the pod any questions, comments, or concerns you have at goblinlorepodcast@gmail.com. The guys will be at GP Minneapolis this coming weekend. That's July 27th through the 29th, and we'll be helping to host a series of events. Follow their Twitter feeds. Any information? Thank you all for listening, and remember, inspiration comes in all shapes and sizes.